delighted to welcome you to ESG event today. I am Elena Lundy-Botteri. I lead the FinTech group for French Tech London. And it's my pleasure to introduce Vincent Gilles this morning. He will be your host for this roundtable. He's a former investment banker with deep expertise on renewable energy. He has written groundbreaking research papers on batteries and solar. He lends his expertise to the EU Innovation Fund, and currently the CIO of Clim8 Invest, a fintech allowing retail investors to put their savings and pension money into clean and renewable energy and renewable assets, sorry. So with no further ado, I'll turn over to Vincent and he will introduce our panel members this morning. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Hélène. I don't know who you're talking about, but he sounds pretty good, actually. Morning, everyone. So Hélène introduced me, so let me introduce the four panelists we have this morning, which I selected because they all are slightly different, but they all share the fact that they know what they're talking about, which is sometimes not the case on ESG panels. I'll start with Matthew. Matthew spent about 17 years at Carrefour, the French retail company. He's various jobs, but the last one was head of ESG SRI communication. I slightly simplify, Matthew, I apologize. And you moved to AKUO Coop in the summer of 2019, if my memory is correct. And you're heading up now what is AKUO Coop, which is one of the most, I would say, original outfits for ESG in France. AKUO, for those of you who don't know, AKUO is one of the leaders in clean energy development in France. Rachel, looking at the sea this morning, is an expert in energy. She originally came from GE, where she spent a bit more than 5 years. And in the last 5 years, she's been an expert working for different bodies, including the EU Commission as an independent consultant and a Coalition for the Climate Resilience Investments. She's soon moving to a new job. I'll let her explain what she's going to do because it's very relevant. And she's also the mother of 2 very young children. And I have no idea how she can do so many things, having to look after her family. But anyway, Mark, you will know Mark's name anyway by reading the Financial Times. He's had a number of papers in it over the last, or articles in it in the last few months, all very interesting and very provocative. He's the chief sustainability strategist at BNP Paribas and one of the core leaders of how this very traditional bank is changing fast. He's also a former competitor of mine, and he spent a lot of time looking at carbon over the last few years and had a little stint at Carbon Tracker. And finally, Enass, and I'm taking people in turn as I see them on the screen. There is no discrimination here, please. She's the founder and CEO of H2Go, which is one of the most exciting hydrogen companies you can find at the current stage. After a very successful fundraising recently, she can explain all about it. She's a member of the Global Future Council for the World Economic Forum, and according to the WEF, one of the 50 most exceptional young scientists globally. She hates flattery, so she's looking down when I say that, but she's got a very impressive CV and the company is absolutely brilliant. She's a Cambridge alumni and she has a PhD in energy storage, among many other things. So what I would suggest is, as soon as we start talking about ESG, it's incredibly easy to lose structure in the discussion and everybody will go in different directions. So I would suggest that we split the E from the SG to start with and probably try to understand how, when all countries or international coalitions like the EU, let's call it a coalition, have targeted to be net zero carbon by 2050. China is 2060. The US will probably have a sort of big number as well at some stage. How are we going to go there? If you take a look at the TPI report that was released 2 days ago, and I'm going to try to share, no, I cannot share my screen, unfortunately, but if you go on the page 23 of the TPI report, there's a fantastically interesting chart that shows how over the last 5 years, most companies have pushed back on their net zero commitment. So if I take a look at, for example, the airlines had targets, not always net zero, for 2020, and now all their targets are for 2030, electric utilities 2040, oil and gas 2040. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that we all have ambitions, but clearly the ambitions are for a couple of years down the road. And the second thing is clearly it's all going to be an issue of whether the technology is available, at what cost, and how we can have the regulation to basically make it work. So I don't know which one of the four panelists wants to start on this question, which I would call the top-down question. Are we going to reach 2050 net zero? Which technology? How? Which price? How do we make it work? Is there a volunteer?
I'll start off if you like, Vincent.
Perfect.
I mean, I think this question now is less of a technical question than a political question, really. I think if we really have the political will to get there, we can. I mean, I think the experience of the last 10 years is of incredible cost reductions in renewable energy, solar in particular, and the potential for further improvements in the efficiency of solar are enormously high. And we really now need to accelerate the deployment of energy storage technologies, because that's one technical bottleneck, perhaps. You know, that is certainly a technical bottleneck. You need storage at scale, but you also at the right scale in the right place, and you need to be able to store the energy for different periods of time, and in particular seasonal storage is the big challenge. But I think if you'd asked anyone 10 years ago that we would be where we are today in terms of the cost of renewable energy, even the most optimistic believers in the industry itself would not have believed we would be where we are today. So there is this very optimistic reading, I think, of the way the technology is developing here. And you mentioned my recent articles in the FT. I mean, one point that I'm making in every intervention these days is the point I made in the FT article I published in December, which is renewable energy. And it's a very obvious point, but it's overlooked nearly all of the time, even by policymakers and perhaps even within the industry itself. And that is this, that renewable energy, or at least wind and solar, are intrinsically deflationary technologies. And that contrasts with 150, 200 years of fossil fuels dominating the energy mix, which are by their very nature inflationary. So you have a deflationary dynamic with renewable energy and an inflationary dynamic in fossil fuels. I say that because fossil fuels, at least in terms of their geology, are self-evidently inflationary, because you exploit the easy to access resources first, and then as those are depleted, you're forced further up the cost curve. Now, it's true that technology improvements can mitigate the rising cost inherent in the geology of fossil fuels, but the point is geology is inherently inflationary, and you're in this constant battle between geology and technology. With renewables, geology and technology, well, there is no geology. That's the point. There is no geology. There is only infrastructure. And infrastructure gets cheaper over time for two reasons. One, because you get economies of scale as you deploy more of it. And two, because the technology improves over time. And that is why we've seen the average cost of solar generation fall from $400 a megawatt hour 10 years ago to less than $50 a megawatt hour today. So the technology here is moving very quickly. We need to scale it up. That's a political challenge. But if the political will is there, I think we can get there. So the big question mark, and there's also a regulatory question around optimal design of the energy market as we move into a system marginal price concept. That's another more detailed question we can pick up on maybe later. But you know, the basic point I think your audience should be aware of is that we've spent 200 years in a mindset where energy is inflationary, and we're now moving into an end game for energy, clean energy, where it's deflationary. And it's very difficult, actually, even though the point I've just made is very simple, and as soon as you explain it to people, they always understand it straight away. But number one, you're fighting 200 years of entrenched attitudes here. I mean, it's even in the economics textbooks, for God's sake, you know, because, you know, the birth of the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuels is cognate with the birth of economics as a discipline. I think that's a topic for a PhD thesis in itself. So we have to overturn attitudes here but the technology is on our side. So I think my answer, short answer, would be a qualified yes, we can get there, but it depends on political will, and it depends on being smart about ordering the energy system of the future in a way that will encourage the continued deployment of renewables and energy storage. And both of those questions are very open questions, obviously, particularly the politics.
I'm happy to go next.
Go ahead.
So just to complement what Mark just said, in terms of the technologies that we have today and the technologies that we will need to have to achieve what we aspire for by 2050, some of them exist, some of them exist at a very small scale, and some of them don't really exist, but you'd have a lot of, you'd have an approach from the large corporates that let's use what we have, because this is the best way to monetize it. And I really think that if we want to be very serious about achieving targets by 2050, we need an integrated approach, which at the moment, I really don't think that we have a lot of encouragement to basically see a lot of things happening on an integrated approach. You do have a lot of innovation on a small scale. You do have a lot of technologies that today is very difficult to justify the economics of, because they haven't scaled to a point where you can say the unit economic makes sense to compete with what's been in the market for 20, 30 years. However, when we talk, for example, at seasonal storage, we know that in a few years' time, seasonal storage is a key that we cannot just ignore. If we don't have a pressing demand for it just now, it doesn't mean that we don't need to develop the technologies that will get us there. And then the question that becomes very highlighted: who's going to fund it? Like, who's going to pay for developing it and scaling it? If large corporates don't have necessarily the need for it because they can monetize what they have, and if government says this is risky, would rather create more jobs at a different scale where large corporates actually can roll out programs that employ a lot more people. I really think that there is like a missing link that should be addressed at some point soon, because our timeline is the climate crisis. We can't really slow down. There's quite a lot to do on the side of, okay, we do have technologies, but we need to make sure that we scale them reasonably well in a short period of time. And we do need different approaches to make sure that when they scale, they're integrated into large infrastructure projects to make sure that economics would work, demand will be met, and at the same time, opportunities will be created.
Okay. I don't know if Rachel or Matthew, you want to add something, or please disagree. That makes things a lot more fun.
I'm happy to go, and poor Matthew gets the final say. I think there are a few important points that have been mentioned. I think one is that actually I don't think we need to be selecting a technology. I think we need to choose a technology. To Enass's point, there's a constant attitude that we need to de-risk everything, right? And then we just need to go for economies of scale. And actually, there's room for so much technology. The issue we have then is the same issues we have now, is that we're moving also from a kind of base load mentality to this fluctuating energy system. And so while we need to support the infrastructure, when it comes to building things that will generate the energy, we're also not taking the time to figure out how to integrate it. So yes, storage matters, and various different types of storage, but actually how are we transporting the energy and storing it? If I'm producing lots of wind in Scotland, I'm trying to use it in London, there's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of frequency issues. There's a lot of new technology, which we're bringing it on, which also changes frequency of the whole system. So exactly to the points made, all of the things that are coming on, we need to actually sit down and look at it much more holistically and figure out how we bring new technology in and how they can help each other. A good example is batteries that we always considered a storage actually really helps with frequency. So you have a lot of different ways to use technology. It's only by using them that we're starting to realize these new ways that they can be effective. And I think the last point I want to make before Matthew can speak is there is still a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? We're talking about coming to try and become carbon neutral, and there's always the various different rules of how we get to 50% is a lot faster than getting to 90% and then 99%, and we're actually still so early in this story. There's so much that can be done really easily. So I think we're actually at a really exciting phase when there's so much change that's going to happen, that's happened, but that's actually really going to happen even in the next 2-3 years as well. Your turn, Matthew.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Rachel. So, well, first of all, very pleased to be part of this prestigious panel here, humbled. No, so just maybe very quickly, I'm quite optimistic about this. I'm very proud to be part of the solution, part of the, working for a company like AKUO, which is really working on innovative projects. Just very quickly, thanks for the introduction, Vincent. But so AKUO is an independent power producer. We're the largest independent player here in France. We work across the value chain from development of projects, financing, construction to operation of projects. And so our model is very much a decentralized model, so sustainable, decentralized, and integrated into the local territories. So that's what we're working on. So we have a balance sheet now of we've invested 2.6 billion into renewable assets. We operate in 15 countries. And in fact, there's a very nice piece in Les Echos newspaper this morning if you want to learn more about AKUO. And I'll come back to what I work for, specifically AKUO Cup, at another time, because we're an innovative financing mechanism for this industry. But basically that ties into what I want to say is absolutely agree with what each of you have said. We need more of an integrated approach. We certainly need capital to be allocated efficiently. And I think Mark, coming from the banking sector, I think the banks have a big role to play here. We have the technology, or it's on the way. At least we have enough technology to get this ball rolling. If you just look at the renewable energy sector, and Mark, you referenced this, costs are coming down, way down. IRENA published numbers recently. So solar PV costs are down 90% over 10 years. Wind turbine costs have come way down 60%. Enass, in your industry, hydrogen is going to come down. Batteries are predicted to come down. We can't predict the future, of course. I wouldn't dare do that. But if they follow similar trends, I think this is it truly is a deflationary sector. So AKUO Cup will play a role there. We want to allow citizens to invest in this, in what's going to be a real boom here. I would make one point as far as the integrated approach goes, and this is a European EU approach. But I think we need to think about the taxonomy debate that's going on right now in Europe. So that this is basically just to make sure capital is allocated correctly. They're working on a sort of a classification system. What is considered to be a sustainable investment? And I know nuclear has entered that debate, and so sort of on the basis that it does no significant harm. So without entering the debate on nuclear or not, which is a sticky one, I think if that were to be excluded, it would have a further impact in terms of promoting renewable energy and making sure that capital is allocated to these truly renewable resources.
Okay, touched on many points. Thanks everyone for this sort of introduction. I'd like to come back on one point made by three of you. We're not here to choose the technology, and the technology will find its own market if the prices go down and actually we find an integration of the different systems. Now, you can't fail to see that governments in Europe have made a choice about hydrogen. I mean, everyone thinks that we're going to go out of COVID through hydrogen. I think Donald Trump probably would think that you inject hydrogen to cure coronavirus, but I think most of it is about launching the economy or relaunching the economy. Hydrogen's beautiful. Everybody thinks they understand what it is. How does that work? How can we get the cost down? And are we genuinely going to have hydrogen cars in the future? There's an obvious candidate to pick up the question first is you, Enass. Will you make my hydrogen car profitable, or I would say workable in the next 5 years?
That is a very good question to ask, and I think we really need to present the two sides of the picture here, because I mean, hydrogen is not going to solve really every problem, every single problem that we have. It could solve many problems that other technologies can't. What is unique about hydrogen is when we have pressure to decarbonize fast. Hydrogen, if it's made from green resources, at the point of use, you're talking about a zero carbon solution. So very elegant solution in terms of its environmental impact. The economic models are out there to make sure that there is a way to actually make it economical. Is it economical today? Does it compete with fossil fuels counterparts or alternatives? It does not. However, we're really not looking short term here. We're looking for the real game is the long term game. Hydrogen can fit in many applications that other technologies wouldn't fit really well. When we're talking about the pressure to decarbonize heavy industries, for example, decarbonizing transportation. If you look at the technological limitations of batteries, for example, when you're trying to just make the positioning exercise and say hydrogen versus batteries, we know how good batteries are for some applications, and you know, if you're talking about EVs, batteries work just fine. They are cheaper, they're in the market. Every day you have millions of batteries being manufactured. The argument is why do you need hydrogen to be like, you know, to be a competitor in transportation? The question is because it complements the limitations, the technical limitations that batteries have, and we do have a pressure to decarbonize transportation because of the immense amount of emissions that we have coming out of our transportations. Where now the hot conversation is really around hydrogen in flight, which is really years ahead in terms of technological advancement, but the environmental argument and the decarbonization makes it very compelling in terms of saying we, as societies, we don't need to be less productive. We don't need to stop traveling. We can find technological alternatives to decarbonize, and hydrogen really fits that bill. So the conversation about hydrogen is, so we know technically it has benefits that complements limitations of other technologies. That's why we should use it. There is an agreement out there. There are commitments that are creating demands. And this is really impressive. Having been in this industry for the past 10 years, 11 years, if you like, what we're seeing now, demand being created, which is not something that we've seen at any point before. Now, what is missing is making it economical, making enough commitments to reduce the cost to a point that is really hydrogen is a compelling, like economical and competitive solution. In my opinion, I am very optimistic that this is definitely possible. We have seen it happening with solar, for example, how the economy of scale evolves and develop. And I think it's definitely, if the demand is being created by governments and private investors and scaled through infrastructure projects that are large enough, there's definitely a way to make it economical.
Okay, there's a very interesting thing is the word carbon hasn't been pronounced so far, maybe once, by the four panelists. So there's, next to you on my screen, Mark, you put out a very interesting piece recently. Not sure it's public, I think it's sort of public anyway, where you were actually going through the motions of how do we make green hydrogen compatible with the normal economics of the world, or cheap enough so that we are going to go from fossil fuel to hydrogen and then from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen. So maybe you want to say a word about carbon, which is the most important element, in my view, to actually move away from fossil fuel to clean energy.
Yeah, of course. And in fact, I mean, I want to pick up on the point you made earlier about not wanting to pick winners, and you said, well, the EU is kind of picking a winner with green hydrogen. But just on this point of picking winners, as a point of principle, so that we're clear on the premises of the debate, fossil fuels get an easy ride because, number one, we don't talk nearly enough about the subsidies that they continue to enjoy, even in Europe, never mind the rest of the world. And I just want to remind people of some key numbers here. So if you talk about explicit and explicit subsidies are, the subsidies that governments put in place to compensate consumers for the difference between the market price and the price at which they are sold internally. This is typically what governments do in developing countries if they're importers. But then you have implicit subsidies, which are what countries like Saudi Arabia do, where they subsidize the domestic market over the price they could get on the export market. But then there's the biggest subsidy of all, which is the externality of public health costs and upkeep of roads and so on, which the IMF, which is not exactly Greenpeace, estimates to be over $5 trillion a year. $5 trillion a year. It's an astronomical number. It's 5% of global GDP, more, 6-7% of global GDP. So the first thing we have to do is get rid of subsidies. If you want to have a talk about we shouldn't be picking winners, we should be letting the market sort everything out, that's fine, but it has to be a level playing field for everybody. That means getting rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, and it means putting a price on carbon so that the externalities of fossil fuels are captured. Because otherwise, if we go back to 2005, solar and wind, if the German government and other European governments hadn't put subsidies in place in the first place on those topics, you remember, Vincent, you and I remember very clearly what many of the utilities in Europe were saying at the time was, oh, we can't pick winners, these subsidies are ridiculous, it's a burden on consumers, it's unsustainable. And actually what happened was, once the subsidies were in place, you got this positive feedback loop between policy and the technology response to the policy. And as the cost came down because of this economies of scale and technology impact, governments were able to reduce the subsidies and at the same time increase the level of ambition of the policy. So what you've had for the last 15 years is a positive feedback loop that's been accelerating all the time. And that's why the cost of solar and the cost of wind has fallen as much as it has. Now, if you bring that up to date today, we're in a new phase of the energy transition where it's not just about the power sector. Electrons from wind and solar are able to compete now directly with molecules from oil and gas in transportation. And green hydrogen is going to be needed, as Enass said, for those parts of the economy that we don't know how to decarbonize today with the direct use of renewable energy. But green hydrogen is just the indirect use of renewable energy, okay? So this is actually about, when you talk about green hydrogen, what you're really talking about is scaling up renewable energy even more quickly. And we know how to do that. And that's the good news. I mean, if you look at the EU's budget, and nowhere near all of this money is going to come from the public sector, but to get to 10 million tons a year of green hydrogen production by 2030, the EU estimates that will cost about 400 billion euros. And fully half of that is going to be for the dedicated renewable energy capacity that you need in order to produce the electricity that will run through the electrolyzers and decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen. The good news is that's doable. We know how to scale up renewable energy. So that's already a very big tick in the box. And yes, carbon pricing will be needed ultimately to make sure that green hydrogen, once it's there, this is all about creating demand, right? You need green hydrogen to be competitive with grey hydrogen once you're producing it at scale. And in the report you referenced, Vincent, my calculations, as long as we can bring the cost of producing green hydrogen down to sort of €2 a kilogram, we're currently at about 5 or 6 euros per kilogram. If we can bring that down to 2 or less by 2030, which I think, I'm not the expert, Enass is the expert, but all the reading I've done suggests that is doable. I mean, through this economies of scale effect, through the technology learning by doing effect, then you need a carbon price by 2030 of about 90 euros a ton. It depends on what the gas price is at the time, because that's the key input for grey hydrogen. But 90 euros a ton in 2030 equates to about 50 euros a ton today, if you discount it back at 6%. And I say 6% because that's the average cost of capital of the companies that are covered by the EU ETS. So we're nearly at 50 euros a ton today. Yesterday, we traded at another all-time high, 44.6 euros per ton. So if we get to 50 euros a ton by the end of this year, we're basically on track for making green hydrogen competitive by 2030. And that means, by definition, we're on track to getting to net zero in Europe by 2050. So that, I think, is how we should be thinking about it.
Okay, so I have the thankless task of keeping an eye on the watch as well. So I'd like to keep you both on that, but let's move to financing, and let's move to the role that some of the oil and gas companies can play. So let's start with financing. We touched upon subsidies essentially by talking about government picking winners and the EU providing the innovation fund, for example. But I'd like to come to two things. The first one is, or it's essentially one topic, is involving population in financing the decarbonization of the economy. And I think probably the question goes first to Matthew here on how AKUO is a template, I guess, for spreading clean energy across population and get them to actually buy into it and actually make it theirs, as opposed to a big government project. And the second thing is, as we experience at Clim8, Enass just went through an incredibly successful crowdfunding exercise. And maybe she can, after Matthew has shared about AKUO, maybe Enass, you can tell us a bit more about your experience. Matthew.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, so I spoke a little bit about AKUO. So AKUO is just AKUO's crowdfunding arm. So we put, quite simply, projects that need financing in touch with investors. So from the project point of view, of course, this provides financing for these renewable energy projects. It also improves the acceptability of the projects on the ground, which is still an issue with these renewable energy projects. It also allows AKUO to share the financial benefits of these projects. So, you know, we've often long time shared the environmental and societal benefits. So this allows AKUO to do that, to share also the financial benefits of the projects. And then from an investor point of view, these assets still have a very competitive yield. It's a way for investors to invest directly into the energy transition. So it's impact investing. And they're investing in real assets. And in many cases, what we like to be able to do is allow them to invest locally, so near their homes or businesses, so they can really invest right there. And one of the advantages that we have with AKUO, and one of what makes us unique, is that we are asking investors to invest alongside AKUO. So we're not asking them to take any risks that AKUO is not taking themselves. So basically, we're asking them to invest right alongside of us. And these are projects that are ready to build, basically ready to finance, and so they have all the permits. They have they benefit from, of course, long-term purchase agreements with utilities. So they're quite secure in terms of assets. So that's AKUO. Maybe crowdfunding as a whole, it's always helpful just to remind the people sort of what that is. So crowdfunding is different categories. So there's donations, loans, and bonds, which is generally what we do, and also equity. And just to give you an idea of the market, crowdfunding in France just surpassed the 1 billion mark in 2020. So that's up 60% over 2019. So it is really booming. And renewable energy assets account for about 10% of that total. So it's a market that's booming, and we continue to want to allow investors, citizens to really invest directly in these assets.
Maybe in 1 minute, you want to take one example.
Sure. Yeah. For example, our next project coming up is a wind project just south of Paris. We will raise 1.7 million to finance this project. Just south of Paris. It's called Gatineau 2, and people can log on to AKUO.com starting on May 4th to invest in that asset. So we've done different assets around, so solar and wind generally, also floating solar, which is one of AKUO's innovations here in Europe, and we've invested. Our most recent success was an asset that we did in New Caledonia. And so we raised, in about 20 days, we raised 800,000 euros for a solar plant in New Caledonia.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Enass, super successful. Thanks very much, Matt. Enass, super successful crowdfunding. Tell us about your experience, why you did it first, and how amazingly successful it was, and what it means for you as a small company.
So why we did it in the first place? Because we needed the money to basically fund the next growth stage of the business. Our theory about this was that if we go directly to the beneficiaries, the impact beneficiaries, the risk will be split, and we might have basically a way to fundraise from the right type of people who, when they want to invest in impact, they are cautious about the risk, of course, but the risk is split between thousands of people. We have spoken to a few impact investors. We have seen very few examples of impact investors actually following a strategy where they fund businesses at risky stages or at early stages based on an impact thesis plus potential crowdfunding because of the DNA of the raise. The nature of the raise is that you have many people splitting the risk between them. You directly speak to impact beneficiaries, and that makes a difference. What we realized on the raise, that actually there were many different types of impact beneficiaries. Some of them are large ticket investors. They are actively they can actively support the business in their growth plan. They have they understand a lot, like they want to understand a lot, what do you need for the next growth stage, and they think about what can they bring beyond the money. And we find quite a few of these on the round. And you have others who will be your ambassadors, who would just encourage you along the journey and say, basically, because I invested in this company, even if I invested £10, I am invested, and this is a very important business to support because of what they do, because of the impact of what they're doing, and all of that collectively is an investment experience that is very positive, and you might not get the same experience raising funding from VCs. In terms of
in 2 seconds, how much did you raise, and over which period of time?
So we raised 2.5 million over 8 days.
It's very impressive. Okay, brilliant. Now, again, keeping an eye on the watch, and we have to talk about SG. The last thing on E will be for you, Rachel. Your experience, you do understand the big oil and gas companies. You do understand the big issues of urbanization, etc., etc. And so I throw the question at you, which is the following. It looks like everything we've been talking about here totally rules out all the traditional energy companies. They seem to be the bad guys and everybody hates them, and it's fashionable to hate oil and gas or nuclear. What role do you see for those companies in oil and gas or for nuclear in the energy transition of the next 30 years if we want to achieve net zero?
The $1 million question, right, for the markets and for
trillion, actually.
I think there are a few things, right? I think we need to kind of think about generations, right? The first generation of energy really has been coal. We started in kind of the 1600s. moved to oil and gas in 1850s. You know, when we start to talk about carbon in the energy system, right? The oil and gas is basically like 0.28 to 0.20 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So the cleanest is natural gas, that's at 0.2. You have batteries is kind of, let's say, generation 3, that's kind of where we are, batteries, and we've got renewable, et cetera. And this is where we are today. We're trying to figure out how we bring all of these things together. And just to give a little bit of context, which is also where, you know, we were just discussing with, when it came to hydrogen, hydrogen is another way we store, batteries are another way we store. We're talking about how we bring the clean energy and dirty energy all to essentially power the way we run day to day. That's Gen 3, that's kind of where I see us. We're trying to then use the least CO2 producing energy to be able to run our everyday. And the people who kind of have that broadest range right now of understanding are really our oil and gas companies. Now, the oil and gas companies are in varying levels of recognizing that transition. So you have some who are going, we're just oil and gas companies, that's all we do, and we're not going to change. And then you have some who are going, we're energy companies. And part of that is oil and gas. And some of that is a rebrand exercise, but some of that is a recognition that actually, exactly as we were talking about in, you know, deflationary and inflationary, is a recognition that actually this Gen 2 of oil and gas is moving to Gen 3, which has a lot less oil and gas, and they need to redesign themselves. Where I think they are some of the best placed people to really understand the ecosystem. However, I fully agree that we need a much better regulation, and especially, I strongly believe, a carbon tax or some valuation of carbon to be pushing those companies to then move faster and to really understand where that oil and gas and fossil fuels are going to fit in. To think that we're going to be able to completely jump from, you know, the oil and gas to totally clean energy, it's not going to happen right away. There are a lot of, you know, industrial processes where the efficiency that is required, actually gas is the right technology there, right? Now, we have a lot of other things where we need a kind of a slope instead of a cliff. And the oil and gas companies should be part of that slope. And to, you know, again, to bring it back to those CO2 per kilowatt hour, and this is coming back a little bit in the discussion we were talking in terms of storage and technology, you know, do we use batteries, do you use hydrogen? If batteries are charged at the same time as your average grid, that's 0.28 kilograms. Natural gas is 0.20 kilograms of CO2. So actually, you can have really dirty batteries. And if you're not getting, and batteries, if people assume are clean, if you're not charging them at the right time, they're dirtier than natural gas because they're as dirty as your grid. And I think part of those, you need people who are really understanding that ecosystem and have the cash to put money into the new technology, to then be rolling it out and to be backing with the brand, because as much as they are bad guys, there are people who go, well, okay, but if I'm in a car and I need to get from A to B, I'm stopping at the petrol station and I know what I'm going to get. And the brand really matters when it comes to people trusting that they have security of energy. And to leave them behind is absolutely not the right answer. But we need to be really pushing to say, you guys need to be greener. And that's, I think, where things are going to change. And you know, the money's going to back that up. The finance, all the discussions we have, and you know, recently, you know, being very open, you know, BlackRock kind of opened up a new fund, and they've put in that fund, which is meant to be renewable and the next generation, they've put ExxonMobil and Chevron in, and then those are the two of the oil and gas companies who are least on that transition. So there's a lot of work to do, both with the oil and gas companies, but also with the funding side and the pensions, to be looking to greenify, if that's a word I can say.
Beautiful word. Okay, and I think I wanted to avoid dwelling into greenwashing, because the sort of name pointing and figure pointing that we can have is enormous fun, but it may actually spoil the conversation. But I have a list for anyone who's interested. Clearly, there's something taking place which is pretty shocking here, but none of you guys are part of it. You very skillfully avoided answering my first question, which was maybe the four of you in one on yes or no. Is nuclear part of the equation for the transition? Starting with you, Rachel.
Yes, for me, nuclear absolutely needs to be. There have been a lot of negative experiences, obviously Fukushima being one of the most recent. But to ignore nuclear as part of the energy mix, it goes back to saying, you know, as I said earlier, no, I don't want to choose technology as saying this is the true technology. Absolutely take the point. We need to have a more balanced playing field, but to remove one of the greenest technologies, which is also can provide a significant amount of our baseload, and say we're never using that, to me is a massive mistake, especially in this transition period. Maybe there's a miracle energy we're going to discover in the future that would change my mind, but right now we need that.
Okay, Matthew.
Yeah,
Yes,
if I could just jump in. Well, I think one thing that so of course there's a lot of debate about this. One thing that there is no debate about is that there's a big problem with nuclear is we don't know how to manage the waste. And so I would just contrast that to renewable energy, where solar panels today, 95% recyclable, that's going to continue to go up.
You're not answering my question was, is it part of the energy transition? I'll put another way. We have nuclear reactors now on the ground.
Right.
Should you use them? Should we use them to accompany the transition, or should we shut them down?
Well, I think that comes back to certainly that comes back to the taxonomy debate. It looks like Europe is going to include them if we believe the leaked documents. So there's still some running time, but just to so I think the debate is more about, are we going to continue to invest in new nuclear assets? And I think so. It's really a capital allocation question. And if it were up to me, and that's what I've sort of dedicated my life to, is financing truly renewable energy sources and allowing citizens to do that.
Okay, so it's a qualified no, actually. If I have to
qualified no, and I hope investors and big banks follow that.
Mark, yes or no? Nuclear.
I think you don't want to be running building new nukes. Is very expensive, hugely capital intensive, and it takes a long time to build. In the time it takes to build a Hinkley Point or a Flamanville, you can and you know, Flamanville, we visited it in 2006.
Yeah, I remember.
It's still not on the grid. And in that period, how much has solar energy fallen in cost in those 14 years? And how much quicker is it to roll out solar capacity? So I struggle with the idea. And then you've got the waste question that Matthew mentioned. I mean, I think the way to answer this question is, if we hadn't discovered nuclear power in the 1950s, again, at massive public subsidy, the amount of public money that has gone into nuclear is astonishing. Again, that's another PhD thesis to be written. You know, they were saying in the 1950s in the UK, once we built these nuclear power stations, it's going to be too cheap to meter. That has definitely not proven to be the case. Solar, I think, is an energy source, the first energy source I'm aware of that has surpassed all of the expectations placed upon it, and is literally in the process of becoming, I think, if any technology is going to be too cheap to meter, it will be solar energy, certainly in the right location. So I think there are significant issues with building out new nuclear power stations. If you can do the modular nuclear, that's the next great hope. Let's see it in action before we spend lots of money on it. We know we have technologies that work now and that need to be scaled up, and we just need the storage solutions to go with it. So I think the baseload argument, I understand it, but if we can develop storage technologies in tandem with renewables over the next decade and with hydrogen, the baseload argument is much less powerful.
Okay, cool. I'll stick with only 3 of you because I know it's incredibly difficult to give a yes or no answer, and myself, I would find it very, very difficult. Now, let's move to something which is a lot more controversial than what we've been talking about. Now, the gender debate, the SG side of ESG. And when I sent my questions to the panelists, I made sure they were very provocative, but sadly, none of you actually reacted. So I'll start with the issue of gender. And my question is parity the holy grail of companies? I mean, should we just say that we are going to be in a different environment in terms of men, women, if we have 50% of CEOs, women, et cetera, et cetera? So that's the first question, which obviously goes to Rachel and Enass first, because I can't, particularly you, Enass, you were very grateful once on the BBC to say that middle-aged men were not an impediment to your development, which I thought was fantastic, as I know you were talking about me. But that's the important thing. The second thing is, how do companies, or how can companies actually navigate the complexity of the SG element? Because obviously men, women is very simple, but then you start having a lot more complex issues. So I know it could take us for hours to answer, but I'd like to have the points of view of you too. And the second question really here will be on corporate governance. So maybe we start, given we have 15 minutes before the Q&A, maybe Rachel and Enass, you take the first one, and maybe Mark and Matt, you can take the second one on governance. Rachel.
So I think the holy grail is diversity of thought. You know, the proxy right now that's being used is gender and race. That's the easiest place to start because it's objectively measurable, and you know, trying to show diversity of thought in some kind of objective spreadsheet is incredibly difficult to do. You know, at the same time, you have so much data about, you know, you have one that just recently was released showing that in the 24 months after appointment, female CEOs saw an increase of 20% in stock price momentum. That's huge, right? And that's so significant that we should be working on it. And I'm saying women, you know, of course it's women, but the point is it's change, it's diversity, it's a little bit different. And that's what we need to be working towards. And to ignore it, I think is a mistake for everyone. And that includes, you know, it's not a male, it should never be a male-female discussion, because the point is by bringing diversity and of, you know, whatever type of diversity, it should be origin as well, you know, so talk about race and gender, but actually in it, you know, in the UK, we should be seeing boards of people from various different backgrounds, various different countries, speak different languages. You have, all of those things are diverse. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be working together on it because everyone wins. Enass, I'll turn over to you.
Just before Enass takes over here, these statistics about 24 months, I think you said,
24 months.
Yeah, and then 24%. It's easy to remember. Over which period of time can we calculate this? I mean, can we say we have 15 years of experience and genuinely it does make a difference, or is it just because you have a very small sample in particularly targeted companies and therefore there's a magnifying effect here?
By definition, you have a small sample because you have a small sample of female CEOs, right, who are taking over. So this is, you know, this is in especially the bigger companies, so like the FTSE 500s, you have fewer female CEOs, so therefore you have a smaller sample size. So you can only use the samples you have. I mean, it's a bit of a difficulty, and you always have the, you know, until you see it, it's hard to believe it. And that's a huge element, right? When it comes to gender, race, it's very hard, it's much easier for, you know, a young Black female to sit and say, I can be the CEO of a company when she sees that it's happened. And that, you know, the perfect example there is especially the reaction of Black men to the election of Obama in America, right? That made a fundamental difference. You have any number of studies that shows that there was a sudden realization that that was possible, and that hugely changed a reaction of especially the young Black population. So, you know, that is fundamental. The numbers just back up that actually it is the diversity. Again, you know, we talk about gender, but gender is a proxy for difference and change. And that change in thought in companies is fundamental. And especially when we start to talk about the green energy side. when we talk about the fact that the whole system is stayed, we're trying to change the way that the system thinks. For that, you need people to come in who think differently and move things forward, or move things to the side, or move things diagonally. The point is to change the way things think. The system is thinking, and right now, bringing in women, bringing in people who are going to think differently is a fundamental piece of us changing the stagnated way that we have been working for the last 100-odd years.
Okay, thank you very much. Enass.
I agree with everything Rachel said. Just to add maybe to it is that if we want to look statistically at where we are across the spectrum, because ESG isn't about only like integrating more CEOs or board members leading, energy companies or companies with strong sustainability agenda. It's about integrating more innovators, more women in STEM, more inventors, more investors, which if you look at every single field of them that is associated with sustainability, energy, and making things cleaner and greener, you'd see that there's a leaky pipeline there. So statistically, there is some. If you look at it this way, it's a depressing picture. But if we look at where we need to be, it's a very optimistic projection. Because in the first place, why do we need more? For example, if we're only talking about the gender question, why do we need more females involved? Because we're solving a problem, which is climate change. It's everyone's problem. It's not only white, male, middle-aged men problem to solve. It's everyone's problem. So everyone should contribute to promoting a solution and do their part. That's why we need more. And there's quite a lot to do, but as well, like there are signs and indicators out there that the change is imminent. It's happening. There's an acknowledgement of that we really score statistically low, and we need to correct that. And it's inspiring to see that there are some initiatives out there that are trying really to correct social biases, corporate governance, and definitely create more opportunities and encouragement to cover fields across the spectrum. So my input on this is really like very complementary to Rachel. Female and gender is important. If you don't have that, you really need to work on a solution. You work with what you have. And as I said before, if role models are middle-aged men, let's work with that to get to where we need to go, because they could be part of the solution and the change as well. Like, it needs to happen there. So you might as well do it with their support. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's very good answer actually. All right, let's move to governance to finish before the Q&A session. Let's start with you, Matt. You're in charge of a division in a still fairly small by energy standard company, AKUO. How do you look at governance? And the reason why I'm starting with you is obviously the fact that you are bringing in this new financing requires a lot of control and therefore governance. Otherwise, it could turn up pretty badly if it's not properly controlled. So I'd like to get your input on this.
Sure. Yeah, and maybe if I could just quickly weigh in on the gender debate as well. I mean, I'm coming to this from a place of incredible privilege. Of course, I realize that, but for me, this is extremely important, but it's no longer a debate question. I mean, there's just no question from personal experience from the research. Diversity in viewpoints, opinions creates more innovation, creates more value for companies. So I just wanted to weigh in there. Maybe from a governance perspective or from an ESG perspective, if I could just take a step back, one thing that I might have a little bit of difference from in this panel is I was a practitioner in ESG in a large company, and then I can talk about what we're doing with AKUO Cup. So I was involved at Carrefour, as you mentioned, in financial communications for many, many years. Oddly enough, and this going back not so long ago, even up through 2015, 2016, we really didn't have any ESG questions on roadshows throughout Europe, North America. We did have a team that was in charge of that as part of our corporate social responsibility department. And so when I started getting interested in these questions, I actually I swapped out of the finance role to go work in CSR to help staff up that department. And it was quite confusing, I would say, somewhat of a mess with all of the different reporting frameworks, different metrics that I was all of a sudden faced with. We were no longer talking about just ratios in euros. So it was really all over the map. And one thing that was quite confusing for me from a governance standpoint, but also just overall, was that our company would be very, very highly rated on one metric, by one rating system, and then bottom quartile in another. So we'd be world-class with the Rebecca Sam, and then bottom quartile on another. And there's actually a study that shows this out of MIT, that the correlation between these sort of big ratings agencies is quite low especially when you compare them to the credit ratings. So I think signals for corporates, it's not real obvious what they need to do, what measures they need to follow. Governance debates, it's kind of all over the map. I'm a big believer that we should be measuring these things. What gets measured gets managed, but I think it's tough from a corporate standpoint. As you mentioned, Vincent, it's a little easier in my current role because I'm working for a much smaller structure, we have much more control over these assets. And as I said, it's extremely important for us to have clear governance around what kinds of investment opportunities, of course, both from the market authority perspective, but also just from a ethical standpoint, is that we want to make sure that we're offering investments to the public that we believe in, which is why we have, and you know this quite well, an independent advisory committee, an investment committee that takes a look at these assets from an outside point of view, and make sure that they reach our criteria, which is, they have all of the permits. These assets have all of the environmental permits, building permits, and a long-term contract to purchase the energy, so that these assets are safe. There will always be a risk in investments, of course, but that they are secure from that point of view. So that's the governance that we've put in place. We feel that having our interests, our investors' interests, aligned with those of AKUO is a further guarantee also of just the safety of these investments. So that's my quick take from both a big corporate perspective on ESG, and also from a smaller company, how we're trying to think about that.
Okay, so and the last word, I guess, from you, Mark. I mean, you and I have been looking at companies for a combined 60 years, and we know how important, we know how important governance is. So my question to you is, how important will governance be to make sure that we actually get companies to deliver what they committed to delivering over the last few years in 2030, 2050? How do we measure progress is another way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that in a minute, but I too want to chime in on the middle-aged white male and the role of the middle-aged white male. I mean, I think Rachel encapsulated it perfectly, really. This is really all about diversity of thought, and to have true diversity of thought, you need diversity of backgrounds. I really think that Rachel summarized that very nicely. If I think about, I actually studied arts as an undergrad, and I've ended up in finance, and I've had a pretty interesting and pretty good career. I don't think it would be possible now, if you were coming out of a UK university with an arts background, to get into finance. You just wouldn't get in the door. You wouldn't get interviewed, actually, because it's all become this massive, quantified. If you haven't done economics, maths, physics, astronomy, if you're not a quant guy, you're not going to get in the door. And of course, you have to have a basic understanding of arithmetic to make it as a financial analyst, but you also need to understand financial markets are very human, you know, and they operate on the most basic impulses of human nature, which reading a lot of great literature teaches you what the primary drivers of human behavior are. So that's one point. And another point, you know, so that's the UK, but if I go to France, I've spent the last 20 years in France. And I remember my first day working in a banking environment in France, and people heard me speaking 3 different languages on the phone and kept coming up to me and saying, how come you speak languages and you're working in a bank? You know, because literally almost everybody I know who works in financial markets in France has a maths or quant background. Not only that, but they've been pretty much to the same school. They've nearly all been to Dauphine. It's extraordinary, the lack of diversity. I mean, truly extraordinary. So this has to change, and breaking down gender, racial, ethnic, social divisions is definitely the first way to do that. So I agree with everything that's been said by my fellow panelists on that point. In terms of the governance angle, I mean, the governance, if you like, is the most mainstream of the ESG debate, right? I mean, before ESG was a thing, you and I were worrying about the governance of the companies we were covering. What's the management remuneration? What are the incentives that board members have to do what they do? And the easiest way of answering that question very often is just looking at their remuneration packages and seeing what they are incentivized to do. And that's why there has been so much focus recently on tying, if you think of an initiative such as the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which is a grouping of about 450 asset owners and asset managers globally with over $40 trillion of assets under management collectively. One of the key questions there is ensuring that company directors are incentivized to meet climate targets, which in all too many cases they are not. So I think governance is crucial, is going to be an increasingly crucial dimension to achieving the end result that we all want, which is for companies that are the biggest source of the problem immediately, i.e. the world's biggest polluters in terms of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, are able to deliver on the plans that they have. And the first, I guess the 2 points I would make are, number one, you need a more diverse boards to be able to recognize the importance of this. And secondly, you need remuneration to be tied to the right indicators. So governance is crucial on that. I would say another thing, and whether they're white and middle-aged or not, I think company directors, the people running the world's fossil fuel energy companies today, for the most part, are people who've spent 30 years or more in their respective companies or in their respective industries, and therefore have a certain mindset of the way the world works. And everything we've been saying throughout this conversation is that the world is changing very quickly in terms of the economics of energy, in terms of the need for greater diversity of thought within company boardrooms. And that's why the diversity angle is so crucial to the governance angle. They dovetail actually very nicely.
Okay, thank you very much to the 4 of you. It's 11:12, and I'm grateful to Hélène. She hasn't started texting me that, come on, we need to start the Q&A, but we probably need to start the Q&A. So
first question we got was, where can we find trusted measurement references of the carbon footprint of various products and services?
Yeah.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's the question, really. And the answer is, it depends what you're looking for. Some products and services are easier to measure in terms of their carbon intensity than others, right? I think one of the biggest debates that's happening at the moment in the institutional investor community is, how do we get decent data on Scope 3 emissions? Because for most sectors, if you think of the GICS classification system for industrial sectors that is used for stock market analysis, I read recently, and it doesn't surprise me, that 21 of the 24 GICS sectors have more than 50% of their emissions are scope 3 emissions, that is to say indirect emissions in their supply chain. And those are very difficult to measure. I mean, it's pretty easy if you're an oil and gas company that you know, you can do a pretty rough and ready calculation. This is how many barrels of oil I sell a year, and you can associate a given level of carbon intensity with every barrel of oil that you sell. But for many other companies, it's much more difficult, and supply chains are going to be, you know, better analysis on supply chains is going to be crucial here, because net zero, which is the other buzzword in the institutional investor community at the moment, everybody wants to have a net zero target for their portfolios by 2050, and we need that. But it's very difficult for me to see how you can meaningfully say that you've figured out how to get to net zero in your portfolio if you haven't, first of all, figured out how you're going to measure the scope 3 emissions in your portfolio. So I'd say that's the #1 challenge for the data dimension to this question, is we need a much bigger focus on scope 3 emissions everywhere in supply chains. I'll just finish with one industry to exemplify the point, or 2 industries. I mean, everyone knows oil and gas and the mining companies, scope 3 emissions are the big problem. But, you know, the food industry, massive scope 3 footprint, you know, and it hasn't come under nearly enough scrutiny for its carbon emissions. And similarly, the textiles industry is hugely carbon intensive, and scope 3 emissions are a very big part of that as well. So I would say that's the #1 priority, getting good data, and everybody needs to put pressure on the data providers and the companies themselves to disclose, report, and measure scope 3 emissions much more accurately going forward.
I would add to what you just said, Mark, that in my current job, there are tons of data you can find, a lot of data providers. Some of them are actually pretty good. So I mean it as a half joke, but many of them are actually pretty dodgy. And I agree with you, scope 3, you need to be incredibly careful in scope 3, in the sense that I'm not going to name the company that does that, but one of the big oil and gas companies has produced or published some partial scope 3 numbers. And in a way, I agree with you, scope 3 for oil and gas is probably the easiest number to calculate. But anyone else on the panel wants to say something about quality of data on carbon, etc.?
I mean, I would say it really comes back to exactly as you were discussing when it comes to governance, right? The problem is everyone's using different measures. And if we don't have transparency of how everyone's measuring things, then, you know, from a governance perspective, everyone's, you know, that's where we're coming back to greenwashing, right? Everyone's saying, well, actually, I'm really green and I'm really green, and everyone's using different methodologies. And I also think that, and maybe I'm a bit too bullish on this, that that's going to start to come out in the wash now. We're you know, we have a lot of methodologies, and we're still in terms of the transition of proving things are green. It's only been quite recent that we're really getting a buzz around green and proving you're green, and people having ESG programs that is proving that. So I don't have a specific, you know, this is the measure everyone should be using. And in terms of my work with, you know, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, that's part of the work that we've been doing, is going, how do you build some kind of standard that you also bring big numbers along? And, you know, so that's been building a coalition of now more than 10 trillion of assets under management. And you go, great, but actually, how do you get all of those people to agree with one way to measure when all of their portfolios are going to be affected? And the answer is, it's going to take some time, and it's going to be really, really small steps. So there isn't going to be, no one is going to find one measure that everyone agrees with immediately. We're going to have to take some time to get there, and then some things will come out, and they're not going to be perfect, but at least we're going to have a flat level that everyone's going to be measured to, and it's going to be oversimplistic, and then we're going to start to build up more and more detail on that. That's what the attempt with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is. That's going to start to get better, and then we're going to start to have transparency and really be able to compare apples with apples. And to your point on oil and gas companies, it's going to be the same. Everyone's going to play a game as long as they can, and once that stops being the case, then we're going to start to come into reality of what's the greenwashing and what's the brand washing and what's the reality.
Okay, just Matthew, just one very quick question. When you AKUO, not only AKUO, but you AKUO publish emission numbers or your impact, I would say, how do you get to those numbers? Are you very confident, a better way to put it, are you absolutely confident your numbers are correct?
Well, I guess I'm absolutely confident that they're transparent. because we use EcoAct numbers. So we give the source, we use the external source, and the calculation for our business, luckily, is quite simple. I go back to my old business and I joined Mark in talking about the food business. So I came from, this was the grocery industry where I was before. Scope 3 emissions, putting forth our best and most sincere efforts. It was extremely complicated to try and calculate those Scope 3 emissions. Where do you stop? Once you've calculated the emissions of beef, do you go then beyond to their food, what these animals are eating? So I mean, it's extremely complicated, and that's not an excuse. I think we wanted to get there. Our efforts were quite sincere. We were, like I said, we were rated differently on different measures. My worry is that I think this will take time. I think we will eventually get there, but do we have that time? And that's the question. Can we wait another 10, 15, 20 years to have that sort of standard definition, or do we just need to decide these are these are polluting industries, these are clean industries, and just go ahead?
Yeah, you will have noticed, by the way, and then we move to the next question, that in terms of the taxonomy, there's a big debate, and you've got a couple of people involved in taxonomy definition that have actually threatened to walk out because the definitions are being tweaked just in the last minute, so that some of the industries that are a bit uncomfortable suddenly become taxonomy eligible. Okay, Hélène, next question.
Yeah, so I think good transition with the reference to food business is a recent downfall of Danone CEO who was pushing for ESG targets, a worrying sign that the finance market is still focused on short-term gains.
Who wants to take that? There's one man who spent a lot of time in the financial market here, but maybe Rachel, you wanna have a go first?
Yeah, I'm going to say it a little bit more broadly. I think, yes, the financial markets are focused on short-term gains, and that shouldn't be a shock. That is the way the stock market works. That's how it's been working for a long time, and that's not going to change. I think where we're going to start to see some interesting movement, which will then be followed a little bit more with the markets, is actually when it comes to pensions and institutional investors, because pension managers have, number one, significant assets, significant investors, so there's investments, so they have weight, and they are trying to balance paying the pensions they have today with paying the pensions they have to pay in 50, 60 years, and guarantee of return to be able to pay those pensions. So they're going to be the people who have a much more long-term view of risk, but also of making sure that those returns are guaranteed. And that's actually where you're starting to see more and more of the pensions being much more vocal. I think legal in general have been particularly good at vocalizing it, and a lot of others. Aberdeen Asset Management, they're really, their ESG and their sustainability people are really big at talking about this, and they're starting to vocally say, we are no longer investing in this fund, and we're no longer investing in it for these reasons. And when you change this and you become more focused, and you can prove to us that you have more focus on ESG, then we will reinvest. And they are doing that, and they're being public about it. And they're saying, now we've reinvested back in this fund, and this is why, because they fixed X, Y, and Z. So it's not happening, of course, at the rate that I would like, or that anyone, I think, on the panel would like, but I think they're the ones who are going to start moving things, and then the market is going to start to follow. But to think that things are going to be able to move right away to kind of long-term thinking, we're not going to get there immediately, but ESG is starting to become a more short-term thought process as well.
Enass, maybe you just raised money on the technology that may not be in the market for the next few years. So would you agree that people are short-term in the financial market? Or investors in general?
You're on mute, Enass.
Yeah, you're not
I
any
will
longer.
do that. So I guess it really depends on what field. I think the majority is fair to say, like statistically, based on results and evidence, statistically, we can say that usually like investors are looking for short-term returns, because this is how you could minimize your risks, and they're very much risk, driven by minimizing risks. So this is where the short term is coming from. I think as of today, it's not easy to name, like, say, 20 investors who would look at long-term visions that, you know, technology that needs to be developed and matured within that frame. You know, they would easily be convinced that this is an opportunity that you shouldn't miss, even if they agree with the potential and the strength of it and all of that. So just from that perspective, I think, at least my experience, there aren't many investors out there who look at the long term, the potential, the need, the demand, the importance, the value, the impact. It's usually, if this happens in short term, then yes, you'd find many investors for it. Longer term, you'd find less.
Okay. Maybe Mark, you want to add a word, given your years on the financial market and your change of jobs in the last few years?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short-termism is the curse of financial markets, I think. But I think the whole ESG movement is trying to move the needle on that, and it will take time to change investor attitudes. But I think you know, you need public-private partnership to scale up technologies. You're not going to do it purely with risk capital from the private sector, and that's why, you know, things like scaling up green hydrogen, you're going to need some support from the public sector. But if the private sector sees that support and believes that it will be maintained, as we've seen with solar and wind, they become very attractive sources of investment, because private sector investors then take a lot of comfort from that government support. So it's all, you know, political will is the cement that has to drive the energy transition. And if people believe in it, if they believe that governments are committed, and that's why it's not enough just to have net zero targets, you need to write it into law, which the EU is in the process of doing, the UK has already done, and you need to have mechanisms in place that will deliver the legally binding target, because even the legally binding target on its own is not enough. If you say, well, there we are, we've passed a law and therefore it's going to happen, it doesn't happen magically. But if you look at the EU, we will have a legally binding target for net zero by 2050 by the end of the summer, and we will have a mechanism in place. We already have a mechanism in place that will deliver at least 50% of the emissions reductions required, i.e. 50% of the economy is covered by the EU ETS, and we know that works. So we need a higher carbon price. But so I think what you're seeing today, I mean, the carbon market is a very good place to exemplify the point, really, because we've seen the carbon price go from €5 a ton 4 years ago to nearly 45 euros a ton today. And if you look at the consensus in the market now, there's a very strong consensus that it will continue to rise. So investors do have faith in that market, in its ability to deliver, because they believe in the network of policies that have been put in place, the long-term target, the fact that it's going to be legally binding, the fact that the mechanism is technically capable of maintaining prices at the required level, etc. And that's really what you need. And then the money will come, and you will be able to bridge this psychological time discrepancy, really, between the desire always for short-term returns and the need for long-term capital deployment.
Okay, that's I think on carbon pricing, the interesting thing is it's largely driven by short-term players, though, and you can see that the hedge funds are all over carbon, which is a contradiction in terms. And it's very hard for me as PA, I mean, personally, to buy carbon. I mean, you and I had this discussion in the past. I mean, as an individual, when I want to buy exposure to carbon, there were 4 funds which were UCITS, so European funds that actually traded carbon in the last few years. Most of them have stopped trading carbon, and the only fund I can buy is actually a US fund, which most of the platforms will not offer in Europe. So that's pretty horrible that people who do believe in carbon will have to go through indirect exposure.
Yeah, well, you raised a very interesting paradox there, which takes us out of the range, but I'm going to make a quick comment on this. I mean, this is the paradoxical thing, that it's the so-called speculators and short-term players that are responsible for driving up the price that will deliver the policy objective, and the so-called long-term investors who are sitting on the sidelines and not investing. I mean, that's an interesting paradox in itself.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay.
So maybe, you know, we are getting to a close, so maybe to wrap this up, what advice would you give to the COP26 participants?
Besides inviting you personally to
exactly, and have you run the show? What would you tell them to make this productive?
Why don't we start with you, Enass? What would you advise?
I'd like to
COP26?
join Helen as well. That would be my advice, if they can extend an invite to me. In all seriousness, I think that my advice would be, let's make this one different if we can. Let's make it different than the ones that we've seen so far. These are really interesting conferences. Everyone is really looking for announcements there. But I think it's about time we see like results and measures, and here are bad plans that gets executed and you know, entered into like legally binding commitments. I think that would be inspiring, that would be encouraging, and advice to look into that direction and make it a different COP.
Rachel?
Yeah, I take Mark's point on government subsidies. I think, though, with COVID, a lot of the governments showing up are struggling to figure out where the money is going to come from. So I would say to push from a policy perspective for those governments to build some form of carbon price, carbon tax. And from there, we can make some serious progress.
Okay. Matthew?
Yeah, absolutely agree. You know, I think Larry Fink, love him or hate him, in his last letter, he said that the pandemic over the last year has shown how fragile we are. And I think that translates well into the sort of the climate risk that we're facing as well. So, you know, I hope they'll take this opportunity, this special moment in time to really shift their economies. As Mark said, you know, political will is the cement that will drive this forward. So shift all sectors of their economy toward you know, toward the more green side of things, and I think that investment, the investment that's going to be necessary, will drive their economies for decades to come. So let's make a harder choice here.
Mark?
Yeah, well, I think you know, you got to have a holistic approach. The governments need to be thinking about this problem holistically and not having different departments within government pursuing contradictory policies. I mean, and the UK government itself is a case in point. You know, I mean, as the UK is the host of this COP, this crucial COP. You know, I'm not going to list them all, but there've been a number of blunders in the last 3 to 6 months in terms of the signaling that is being sent to other governments around the world. I mean, we had the fiasco over the Cumbria coal mine. We've had cutting of foreign aid in the UK government's budget, which sends a terrible signal to Rachel's point about, you know, the financing that will be needed in particular for developing countries to help them move along. So I think all governments really need to put climate change at the center of their thinking, in the way that the Biden administration appears to be doing in the United States. I mean, one of the most interesting things that the Biden administration is doing is taking a holistic approach to climate change and ensuring that all the different departments of government are pushing in the same direction. And I think that is the advice I would be giving.
Okay, super clear. Thank you very much. Hélène?
Vincent, your own advice?
It's going to be very low quality, as you would expect from me. Stop talking, do something. I'm a bit sick and tired of this COP. I can't even follow how many there were so far. And then usually the rich world has a level of hypocrisy which is absolutely staggering, in the sense that, let's be blunt, I mean, what we say is we can afford to decarbonize our economy. If you're in the middle of development, can you please slow down? Because frankly, I would like to enjoy cleaner air so that my kids will get a better life. If you want to hear something very interesting, I'm not sure it's public, but there was a conference with the CEO of Total this week on Monday morning, and that's exactly what they were saying, and that was brilliant. Priyanee said, we have to stop being hypocritical and claim that we are going to decarbonize the whole world, and essentially tell low-income or middle-income countries that they should stop their development so that we can enjoy better quality of life. So we need to essentially make it gradual and make sure that we adopt the right technologies at the right pace. And I thought that was very good to hear. So I find COP processes largely ego-driven, and usually the compromises are pretty poor. I had another word in mind, but I'm not going to use it in public.
All right, I think that has lived up to our expectation that this would be a provocative ESG roundtable today. So I'd like to bring this to a close, and for that I will pass on to Raph Crouan. So Raph, if you're on.
Yes, thank you very much, Hélène. I was, first of all, thank you very much to everybody here. I'm the president of French Tech working with Hélène, and I wanted to just jump in. I was a very fascinated participant in the background since the beginning of the conversation. I just don't want to hijack, but I just wanted to thank you all very much for this very, very insightful conversation this morning. And taking my job, thank you also, Hélène, for organizing this. I mean, obviously the panel is stellar, and I hope we'll have more conversation in the future around this. We do care a lot about this topic at the French Tech, not only in London, but across the board. And you know, Mathieu being French, and I'm sure, you know, Mark, you've been in France a lot. You've seen the efforts that we've done. Not going to talk about you, Vincent. Of course, you've done that a lot. So again, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been extremely interesting. I know we've recorded, and I will leave the last word to Hélène. Again, thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous with it today. So hopefully you found this also a valuable experience, and we look forward to host you again in different settings or to explore, you know, more on this topic. We had some pending questions we didn't have time to tackle. Some people have asked for 2 more conferences to tackle the S and the G in more detail. So you can tell there was real enthusiasm. So heartfelt thank you for your time and expertise today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.